Hey, what's up, guys? This is Ricky D, and today we have episode number 22 of the Elite Fitness Podcast. And this is part one of a two-part interview with Mr. Rick Collins. Rick Collins is the United States' foremost legal authority on performance-enhancing drugs and supplements. Rick is the official legal advisor of the International Federation of Bodybuilding, the IFBB. He is also an author with his book called Legal Muscle, Anabolics in America, which we will discuss a little bit in this podcast. And look, guys, everybody from bodybuilders, Olympic and professional athletes, sports coaches, trainers, criminal lawyers, physicians, pharmacists, military servicemen, even the police from across America have paid for the opportunity to access Rick's knowledge and get his help in handling a whole variety of drug cases and with connections to fitness and bodybuilding. He is admitted into practice in New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Texas, and in the District of Columbia as well. I'm reading my notes here, guys. Rick's also a nationally certified strength and conditioning specialist. So he is the authority on everything to do with legalities around bodybuilding, drugs, supplements, and we're going to talk a lot of that on this podcast. So just hang on. This is part one of a two-part episode that I know you're sure to enjoy. And without further ado, here's Mr. Rick Collins. So I think everybody's really wanting to know what's going to happen with these SARMs, with these not for human consumption research items, and even some SARMs being sold in capsules now. What's going to be the future on that, and how long that's going to keep going on for? What's going to happen? Because if they get scheduled, these pharmaceutical companies haven't made their money on them. I mean, what do you think? What is your opinion on it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Rick, on the podcast. I appreciate it. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. You bring up research chemicals and sort of these things that are sold not for human consumption over the internet. And I've probably handled more of these cases where the government has gone after people or companies that do it than as far as I know any other lawyer. So, and this goes back. So what the future is, we'll look at what the past is, right? So it's been about 20 years that this market has existed, not for SARMs. It started out with other types of ancillaries for bodybuilders that were being sold for research purposes. And SARMs are just kind of the latest chemicals that are being sold for that purpose. But the government doesn't like it, right? Big Pharma doesn't like it. And the government and Department of Justice don't like it. And the FDA doesn't like it. And so they have gone after
head shops too. They're head shops too that sell not, for research only items that are for people to get high or have lucid dreams and crap like that.
Exactly.
That's also.
Yeah, exactly. If you remember a while back, you remember Tommy Chong, Cheech and Chong?
Yes, I remember them. Yeah.
Those comedians, they, the whole bit was just, they were weed heads and they were just getting high all the time. And they made a bunch of movies about smoking marijuana and having a good time. And after they made those movies, and that was really what both of them, Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong, were known for. So Tommy Chong decided to start selling bongs, right, over the internet.
Pyrex. Yep.
So he set up this website to sell bongs, and he said on the website not to be used for smoking weed. And so even though he was selling bongs and he had pictures of him, looking high, and his entire reputation was based on smoking weed, he would say not for smoking weed. And the government went after him under the idea that this was fraud and that he was in fact selling paraphernalia for the purposes of smoking weed, even though he said he wasn't. And so just saying something is for one thing and not another is not necessarily the end of the story if there are circumstances or facts that suggest that it's just bull. right? So him saying not for use with marijuana when there was really no other legitimate reason you could even come up with for why people would be going to Chong's Bongs and buying bongs. He was prosecuted and he was in fact convicted of trafficking in drug paraphernalia. So that sort of, calling something one thing and it actually being shown to be something else under the circumstances is the same theory that the government uses to go after people selling SARMs, peptides, erectile dysfunction drugs, anti-estrogens, anything that typically people in the fitness or bodybuilding community are using sort of as adjunctive kind of things to steroids. Any of that, if you're selling it not for human consumption, but the circumstances show, well, it's obviously for human consumption, that's a problem, and that's something the government goes after.
Now, do you think that at least we already know research, Novadex and Clomid, some of this stuff is probably not going to become highly like race and scheduling. Do you think that that's going to happen with SARMs? Will they be scheduled the same as steroids? Will GW Cardarine and Ostrin and some of these products be categorized same under the law as testosterone and Dianabol at some point, or what do you think?
So first, we could have a long discussion someday about how it is that testosterone wound up in the Controlled Substances Act, in the same law with heroin and cocaine and marijuana and oxycodone. How did testosterone get there? And it happened in 1990 that Congress put it in there. And we could talk about the hearings that preceded it and why Congress appears to have taken that action, and whether, in fact, it was the right thing to do. Not many people realize that in those hearings before testosterone became an anabolic steroid, the DEA, the FDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the American Medical Association all sent representatives to Congress to testify against scheduling testosterone and other anabolic steroids as controlled substances. No, few people seem to remember that from 30 years ago, including folks in the DEA and the FDA. But that was their position at the time, and we could definitely talk about whether that was the right thing to do, because Congress obviously disregarded all of their testimony and instead listened to some folks who were in organized sport who were complaining about cheating in sports. So that happened in 1990. And, when Congress is presented with what they think is a potential sports cheating scandal, this is sort of their go-to, right? They take it and they make it a controlled substance. So there have been some highly publicized cases of elite level athletes testing positive for Ostarine and other SARMs. And obviously anti-doping authorities are upset about that and are looking to try to keep these substances out of drug tested sports. And so, similar to what happened in the ramp up to the 1990 Anabolic Steroid Control Act, some folks in Congress started looking at whether we should make SARMs into Schedule III drugs, just like steroids, under the theory that they have similar or somewhat analogous anabolic properties, and that athletes are abusing them and using them to build muscle or enhance performance in a way that organized sports people and anti-doping people think is unfair. And so I think it was probably 4 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, two senators, Orrin Hatch and Sheldon Whitehouse, introduced a bill that would make SARMs into the same level Schedule III drugs, similar to testosterone and anabolic steroids, which would effectively make it illegal to sell SARMs unless it was pursuant to a prescription. And of course, a lot of these things are not approved as FDA drugs. But it would also make it illegal to possess them. And that's different from today, Rick, because right now, the laws that we talked about before of like sort of fraud and selling something as a research chemical when it's obviously not for research, it's for people to use, whether it's to get high or to get jacked, it's for people to use. That you can go after the seller, the marketer, and I've represented a lot of people who market peptides and SARMs who call me up and say the government has just conducted a search warrant. They've just called me and let me know that they're investigating me, or they've just questioned me for selling, for marketing, for introducing those substances into interstate commerce, which is what makes it a federal crime. But if this law were to pass, this SARMS Control Act were to pass, then somebody who bought SARMs, somebody who's possessing a bottle of Ostarine in their car or their house, if that were to be recovered by law enforcement, that would be a crime under federal law and could be prosecuted, and that guy could get a conviction and potentially jail time just for possessing a SARM.
Yeah, definitely. I always thought that one of the reasons steroids kind of sort of, it was easy for them to be classified, become illegal in 1990. I think the big sports scandal was Ben Johnson and Carl Lewis. Ben Johnson beating Carl Lewis, testing positive for Winstrol at the time of the Olympics. And I think most of those drugs were already past their patent protection time. And
Right.
So the pharmaceutical companies couldn't quite protect them. And they wanted to also launch new drugs to take their place in some of these diseases that were being prescribed for. And I think because it makes it a lot harder, it makes it a lot different for a doctor to prescribe something once it's in that category than when it's in the same level as as an anti-estrogen, as Novadex or something dumb like that. And but the pharmaceutical companies haven't quite made their money on the SARMs yet. Maybe I got my tinfoil hat on a little bit, but I think I've always thought that
just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, as the old saying says, right?
I mean, I've seen so many weird things happen, like NAC becoming now you can't have it in your supplements anymore. I have a supplement that I have NAC. I had to the new version, can't have it anymore. When I see some of these things, I think like there's more at work. Now, SARMs are not illegal yet. Have you seen anyone do jail time over SARMs or peptides or research?
I have seen people do jail time over SARMs and peptides. Not huge amounts of jail, and the facts are always dependent on individual circumstances in a case, and the ultimate result has a lot of factors that go into it. I have seen, and I'd never breach an attorney-client privilege, so this is just knowledge you could get from just looking at the public dockets and whatnot. And my clients typically don't go to jail, and I fight like crazy to avoid that happening. But there have been cases where in other situations and with other lawyers and even with facts that are unpleasant. So obviously, whether somebody gets jail time or not depends on a lot of factors. It depends how much money they made in a fraud case, how much drugs they moved in a drug case, whether they have priors. So if somebody's already done 5 years, let's say, for trafficking in drugs and now gets involved in, selling peptides or SARMs under circumstances where it's clear that they could be proven that these things were not for research purposes, that they were for human consumption, and that the guy selling them absolutely positively knew it and that was his intent, then there can be jail time on those cases. It's not the same amount of jail time as would go into a heroin or a cocaine case or something like that. But prior criminal history plays a big factor, and what the facts are, how much evidence there is that calling it research chemicals and saying, having a disclaimer that the buyer needs to click on saying, I'm a researcher, I'm not going to use this, how clear and obvious it is that that's just BS.
Have you seen in any cases people being affected? Like, I have a podcast, we talk about antibiotics. I've had people on who talk about the steroids and stuff like that. Has anyone been in trouble for just having the First Amendment right to talk about these compounds and even advise people on how to use them? There are a lot of very popular YouTubers that have, some of them, millions of followers, millions of views, that are just talking about how to use stuff, everybody, Dave Palumbo, more plates, more dates, Tony Hughes. I mean, all these guys are on social discussing in pretty close detail the usage of these things, answering questions from people. What have you seen anyone be affected by it?
So the First Amendment gives a lot of protection. People are allowed to talk about things, and that's not criminal. And it's very hard for the government to prosecute people for simply saying things, unless there's something a little bit more involved than that. So if you look at it on a spectrum, on the one end, it's, somebody, let's say, just saying, here's the sort of stack that I've used in the past, and that's just FYI for information. There's no way the government could prosecute somebody for telling the truth about what they've used in the past. At the other end of the extreme is somebody who's either selling steroids themselves or saying, here's what I've used and here's how you can get it, and having a link to somebody, an underground lab or something like that, or directing people to it. Obviously, if you're facilitating the possession or purchase or sale of controlled substances, well, then it's a whole different thing, right? Then you're in the potential criminal harm's way. So a lot of the conduct is somewhere in between, right? And there's a spectrum where, it's more than just, here's what I've used in the past, and I don't necessarily condone it, but this is just FYI what I've done, to the other extreme. And, where the line lies between those two, where the scale tips from protected speech into potential criminal conduct, either conspiratorial conduct, where arguably you're facilitating or aiding or agreeing with the seller to sell it, is really very fact dependent. So a lot of people sort of operate in that gray area, hoping that they're on one side of that equation, that they don't tip over, and recognizing that these are sort of tougher cases to prove for the government than simply going after the underground lab guy himself, right? Somebody who's much easier, low-hanging fruit. And so with limited resources and limited manpower or staffing, the government typically goes after the easier cases. And so people play the odds that even if they go over the line, chances are the government won't go after them. And if they do go after them, well, then they'll call Rick Collins and he'll be able to, work his magic on it. So that becomes, I think, the thinking for a lot of people.
You've been defending these kind of cases now for going on, what, about 25 years now? My
Pretty
mistaken?
close, man. That's scary. It's scary,
It's been a long time.
I'm only 35 years old. How could that be?
So, because I remember your book Legal Muscle, came out around 2002, 2003.
2002. Yep. And I'd worked on that for a couple of years. Yeah. So I've been doing it for a while before that.
I remember we worked with your affiliate program for that book back in the day. Now, Do you have an updated version of Legal Muscle out there yet?
So I don't know if people read books the way they used to,
Audiobooks, man. You got to have
yeah,
Amazon and
yeah.
Audible. And
Yeah,
you could do a good
maybe
Audible
that
book.
would make sense. Maybe that would. I mean, obviously, since 2002, a lot has changed, right? I mean, the
Man.
laws have changed. That the 1990 steroid law was in place then. That was changed in 2004, and then in 2014, you had the Designer Anabolic Steroid Control Act that now exists. The U.S. Federal sentencing guidelines have changed dramatically back then. To be a lot tougher on the same quantities of steroids that the same amount that would have been possessed or trafficked in prior to 2006 when the guidelines changed was completely revised and much more harshly treated after that. So and the literature has evolved too, and the market has evolved. If you look and this back in the 80s and early 90s, before the Control Act really started having its effect, the steroid products were typically diverted US FDA approved pharmaceuticals, right? Getting backdoored.
Yes.
Right, out of friendly
Guys
pharmacists.
would argue guys would argue between which was better, human grade or vet grade. If you the lower level stuff, you would just get veterinarian grade from Mexico. It was still ran by an approved lab, but
Right.
That was the argument back in the day. Now everything is underground. Yeah.
Right. So what's happened is, well, for a while it sort of, you were getting finished products coming in from overseas, and then as the imports started getting more and more of a crackdown on them, then finally now what you just have is raw powders from China coming in, and underground lab chemists esterifying it in their homes and slapping a label and selling it as an underground lab product. So the market has changed a lot. Back in the before I wrote the book, you were starting to see some clinics, TRT type prescribing going on, but now you've got even clinics that are franchised, focusing on men's health and wellness and using testosterone and other, even sometimes other types of peptides to treat people in aging men, to make them feel better. So the market's changed a lot. At some point, yeah, I could see another book or some sort of audio book or something along those lines, but I kind of been covering it in my magazine column. I do a column for Muscular Development magazine, and I've been doing that since just about when I wrote the book, actually before I wrote the book. So if people want to see like what's the latest thing going on, Muscular Development, either the print copy or musculardevelopment.com has a lot of my archived columns on it. And I've covered everything from the SARMS Control Act to FDA related changes, dietary supplement issues, just general health and wellness policies, and kind of what bodybuilders and people in the fitness community should know about what's going on with laws, policies, and even like cultural and social developments. So that's one way of finding out. And I'm also active. I do a lot of these podcasts, and I'm active on social media. Anybody who wants to follow me can follow me on Instagram at Rick Collins ESQ. You can follow me on Facebook at Rick Collins Online. And so those, and I'm on Twitter too at Rick Collins ESQ. So I try to keep people up to date.
Which is your strongest outlet? Everybody's got social, has a really strong outlet. Where would you say your strongest at? IG or Twitter or Facebook?
Yeah, you know what? I'm finding that Instagram is a good way. I get more people, more eyes on stuff through Instagram, even though it's more visual based and less content based. And I'll put in my bio, I'll put links. If you go to my Instagram account and you go to the bio and the link tree there, you'll see a whole bunch of links to podcasts, to articles. I just wrote an article, actually. I co-authored a piece, and I've written a number of peer-reviewed journal pieces. And I just wrote a piece that is something that's fascinated me for a long time. And it's the difference between the way we treat gender dysphoria and muscle dysmorphia. And muscle dysmorphia is like bigorexia, right? The guy who on a mental illness standpoint, right? I mean, and that, look, there are bodybuilders who have that, right? I mean, that no matter how big you get, you still look in the mirror and you think you weigh 110 pounds soaking wet with change in your pockets, right? And at some point, that's a indicative of a mental disorder, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, I still have to get bigger, I need more size on my chest or arms, but it's another thing when it reaches a level where it's actually a disorder. And gender dysphoria is also categorized as a mental disorder, and it's the idea that somebody who has one gender that they were born in it feels that that's the wrong gender, and they're imprisoned in a body that doesn't match their self-perception of who they are. And obviously, if you're a female at birth and you self-identify as male, then the law allows you to be prescribed testosterone in order to change your body to match your self-perception, right? Because you're treating that disorder. With bigorexia, if you go to the doctor and you say, I'm 140 pounds, but I self-identify as 240, and I would like testosterone to try to match my self-perception to what I see in the mirror, that doctor's going to throw you out of his office, and you're going to be sent to a shrink to try to make you accept the way you look. And the article is provocative because, and I'm not saying that in any way that trans or non-binary people should be denied testosterone. I think you should be happy in your body, and if there's a scientific approach to allow it, great. I'm fully supportive of that. And we're not even saying that people who want to get bigger should be prescribed testosterone. What we are saying is that the gap between those two treatments, so that one is looked at favorably and almost celebrated in modern society, and the other sends the doctor to prison and and makes it a crime for a person to possess it for those reasons. That's a pretty far gulf. And I'm not sure anybody's really looked at how wide that distance between those two approaches is.
It's sad, but even just having this conversation and some mediums would get us canceled. Just even bringing up these questions and even talking about them. One thing I will say is this: I had this conversation, actually, believe it or not, a good almost 10, 15 years ago, before everything that's going on around was going on, because it's always been easier for transgender people to get prescriptions for hormones than it's been for bodybuilders. And I remember having this conversation with somebody I respect, a gay gentleman, and his answer was, well, Rick, they fought for those rights, And I think it kind of boils down to us bodybuilders. We kind of hide our use. We're kind of shy about it. We're embarrassed by it. But I think it wouldn't take much for us to turn this whole thing around and be able to be prescribed it. We just got to come out of the woodwork, stop fucking hiding.
Yeah,
and come out and say, this is what we want. Pot users are now having their day. So it's no longer illegal to possess pot, but it's illegal to possess Diana. But I mean, that's crazy. Now, anybody who's who's transgender, feels they're born in the wrong body, they're able to get hormones. Obviously, well, they fought for those rights hard, but we hide. And I don't know. I mean, besides me doing a podcast, having conversations with gentlemen like you, and just getting the information out there, what else could we do? Because I mean, it really is that simple, dude. I think it's just it's not even, it doesn't have to be a big movement. We just got to come out and
Right.
say, look, we want to just enhance, we want to have rights to enhance, but we hide it from our own families. I think steroid use is probably more in the closet than than a lot of gay folks out there.
Well,
I mean, on
yeah,
social, there's a lot of fake naturals on social. There's a lot of guys that won't admit to their own use.
yeah,
I see a lot of fucking
yeah.
jack dudes in suits, and you know, not everybody talks about their cycle and what they're doing. So
Right.
I think that's got a lot to do with.
Yeah, it's funny. Certainly the pro marijuana lobby, and it may be just that there's probably maybe more people who smoke pot than are doing gear, and so it picked up more steam.
I feel
There's
that.
also sort of an anti, there is, and we cover this in that article. There is sort of an anti-testosterone kind of aspect to modern society, right? I mean, the words like testosterone poisoning are acceptable, and like hyper masculinity and masculinity in general is not looked at the way it was 40 years ago, when icons were John Wayne and be tough and be hard. That those sorts of ideas have evolved and gone away, and we live in a society now that is much more empathetic and more interested in emotions and feelings, and has sort of, I co-wrote a piece with a friend of mine a number of years ago called Estrogen Nation. And so, I think the movement, the zeitgeist, as they say, of modern America, and maybe even in other countries too, is sort of a softening of the what is acceptable and what is looked at as favorable conduct, behavior, and such. And so testosterone and steroids are on the wrong side of that cultural evolution.
For sure. Even as a marketer, trying to get ads ran on Facebook, it's easy to get your ad ran for anything weed related, pot related, dispensaries, training programs to participate in the industry, CBD supplements, all that. Now you try to have an advertising approved with abs in it, or some dude, flexing, or things like that, or even bottles of supplements. It's anything to do with fitness, musculature, becoming bigger, portraying the ideal body. I think it used to be a cause for an ad rejection on Facebook, even just social media, and they control so much of the flow of information. They're all against it. I mean, they're for pot big time, but they're all against anything to do with fat burning, with muscle, with gaining muscle.
Well, look at the whole success of a franchised gym like Planet Fitness, right? I mean, the whole success of that franchise is based on an anti-bodybuilding campaign. Their whole campaign is that bodybuilders are uneducated, stupid, terrible people. And the most famous ad is the guy who walks around in the Planet Fitness saying, I pick things up, I put them down. And the Planet Fitness trainer walks him around the gym and says, I have a spot for you, opens the door, and of course puts him back into the alley behind the place and slams the door on him. And the idea that you can't deadlift in a Planet Fitness, you can't spot somebody or make a lot of noise in training, or have a gallon water jug with you, is, when they pride themselves on the idea of no judgment, or being a judgment-free zone. Apparently it's no judgment against people who are completely out of shape or obese, but complete judgment against anybody who is in great shape. And that's worked for them, right?
Yeah, man. This world is kind of losing me. The models are now overweight. There's nothing to aspire to. The models are overweight. The new Batman, this kid who's going to play Batman, he refused to work out for the role. Matter of fact, he went about the press about it. He says, I don't want to be set a bad president, and keep asking me to get in shape. Like I'm an Avenger. I'm not that. Yeah, man. It's definitely a different world, man. You let somebody borrow the car now, they don't bring it back with a full tank. You know,
Yeah.
people, people are
Well,
just
it's like, look, there's a happy medium, right? I mean, nobody should ever be shamed about their body, I think in some ways, where we've gone is good for some people. I mean, certainly if you're, if you have some medical problem, or if you're just overweight, and people should not be made to feel bad about themselves. But on the other hand, we should also inspire people to improve. I mean, all of us can. There's not one of us who can improve in some way. And if the message is simply accept yourself exactly as you are and don't try to improve in any way, physically or in other ways, we're sort of like celebrating mediocrity, and I'm not sure that's really where we want to go. The other thing I just wanted to say, just because you were bringing it up about weed, before I forget it, is that you may have been following, and this is another big development, you may have been following what's gone on in Oregon. So in Oregon, they actually, very progressive state, they actually changed their law, and they have decriminalized the possession of all drugs in Oregon in small amounts, so that if you're in possession of a small amount of heroin, or you're in possession of weed, or whatever it is, it's no longer a crime in the state of Oregon. And that was done, I think, in looking at maybe social equity and social justice issues.
Yep.
But I mean, the funny thing about it is, because they made all controlled substances decriminalized, guess what got swept up into the decriminalization? Anabolic steroids, right?
Juice.
So
the juice.
I'm sure that wasn't in their minds when they did it. And maybe had they thought about it, they might have tried to carve them out, because I think it sort of contrary to the way their worldview might be. But yeah, so bodybuilders in Oregon,
federal laws still apply to the federal laws still fall over all these little.
The federal law still applies in every state, right? And that's why even in states, for example, where they've legalized marijuana, that doesn't mean that it's legal under the federal law. The federal law still makes it. Marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. Even cocaine is Schedule II. Steroids are Schedule III. Marijuana is Schedule I, which means there is no accepted medical use for marijuana. Even though I think anybody with, who can do a simple Google search would see that, there is support for the idea that marijuana can have medical uses under the right circumstances for people. So yes, federal law still applies, although the feds and the DEA typically never go after personal users. It just wouldn't be worth their while to go after some guy with a vial of Trenbolone in his kitchen. So in Oregon, when state law changes, at least for personal use, small amount matters, it really has a pretty dispositive effect on personal use situations.
Is a pill of Dianabol still considered like a pill of ecstasy under the law, under the sentencing guidelines that changed in the 2000s, or is that been reeled back? Because somebody listening to this might think in Oregon they could walk around with their bottle of D-bol in their pocket, and no, that's 100 capsules,
Yeah.
tablets, whatever. You're
Yeah.
going to jail, bro. Like, you have 100 ecstasies.
Right. So state law defines, and different states can define different amounts. Some states will make personal use and misdemeanor situations based on circumstances of the possession. Others have a set number of pills or units that they use. But under federal law, you're right. In 2006, the guidelines were changed. And up until then, it's interesting because prior to the change in the guidelines in 2006, you had 50 tablets was one unit. of steroids, and 10 cc's was 1 unit. So basically, if you had a 10 milliliter vial of stipionate, that was 1 unit. If you had 10 vials, that was 10 units. If you had, 100 D balls, that was 2 units. So in order to get up into jail, prison exposure, you needed a damn boatload of steroids, right? So, and that was true in the earlier part of, this century. I was actually part of the working group that was brought to
I remember
Washington.
reading that article. Yep.
Yeah, so I testified
To help figure
out
out how much are guys really using.
Yeah,
I remember
was
you
part
had
of all
clients
that.
get into situations that were doing heavy cycles, and they
Right.
would get pegged with these crazy charges of distributing. Well, no, this is like what this dude does in a month.
Right. Yep. And it's because
I remember
that's
reading
so
that
different.
article.
Yeah. And even the patterns of use are so different from what the DEA and the government is used to, right? I mean, if you're a crackhead, what's your
Every day
purchasing?
they buy a little bit every day. That's
right. You go out, you get high, you come off it, you go back out, you get some more crack, you come back, you smoke it, and then you go out and you look for more crack. So you're never in possession. The only people in possession of huge amounts of crack, or even moderately large amounts, are people who are selling it. But obviously, you and I both know that steroid users are pack rats, right? I mean, you're going to acquire everything you need for your contest prep, for your full cycle. And so you're going to have a whole bunch of different drugs, and you're going to have enough of them. And so a guy who's just a, mid-level NPC competitor might have what the feds would look at as, the Pablo Escobar of steroids. So I did testify about that, right? And but the guidelines changed, and so now 1 tablet is 1 unit. So it matches Vicodin and other Schedule III drugs. So 1 tab of D-bol or Anavar or Anadrol, doesn't matter whether it's a 5 milligram tablet or a 50 milligram pill, it's 1 unit, and half of a cc is 1 unit. So now that vial, that 10 cc vial of DECA is now, instead of it being 1 unit, it's now 20 units. And so the more you have, the more the units add up.
Changed everything up.
Right, that's right.
All right, guys, so that was part 1 of the Rick Collins interview. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of the interview, where we get into the TRT clinics and we talk a bit more about Rick Collins and his career and how he's helped people out in the industry. So it's a very, very interesting part of the interview where we talk about some of the actual ways and devices he uses to really help his clients when they get into some hot water. So stay tuned next week, episode number 23 of the Elite Fitness Podcast, part 2 of the Rick Collins interview. See you next week.